absolutely thrilled to welcome and introduce Dr. Neus Figueras, who holds a PhD in language testing from the University of Barcelona, and this of course has been her research domain and her domain of expertise for a long number of years. She's worked in the Regional Ministry of Education in Catalunya for 20 years, coordinating curriculum development and certificate exams for schools teaching languages to adult learners. She's been involved in a number of international research and development projects and collaborates regularly with the Council of Europe in the dissemination of the Common European Framework of Reference in relation to testing and assessment. And we have had lots of discussions in relation to the Common European Framework over the course of today. So I think it's particularly apt that we're finishing with our final plenary speaker focusing on the CEFR and the impact that it has on language testing and assessment in the 21st century. So Neus, you're very welcome and thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Thank you very much for the presentation, and thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to be in Dublin for my second time, but my real first time in Ireland. Thank you, Sue, for having invited me. And thank you, all of you, for having stayed until the very last slot, and you're going to bear with me for what Zainab called the dark side assessment. I've tried to sneak in the different breakout sessions to see what was going on, and I did make some minor changes to my presentation, although I think that what I had prepared is going to be still useful after a full day of discussions on the CEFR and on assessment, because basically following the information I got from the organizers, I knew rather well that you came from different places, you came with different responsibilities, and you wore different hats in your everyday work. Some of you wear only one hat, which may be one of those, but some of you may wear 2 or 3 of these hats, depending on the day of the week or depending on the moment of the day. You also come from different contexts. You not only wear different hats, you also come from different contexts. And I like this diagram that we prepared with a group of colleagues, because I think that it illustrates rather well the different perspectives and purposes of assessment that we normally interact with during a course. And in dark blue, you have the external assessments, from international to school assessments, but assessments which come from the outside, which are externally generated in different contexts, either using international tests, national tests, or district assessments. And then in the center, you have what goes on in the classrooms. Classroom assessment based basically on the user, thinking of the user, and using materials such as portfolios or self-assessment checklists. In that context, taking into consideration that you come from different contexts and you wear different hats during your working days, I'm going to try and discuss basically 3 issues. The story so far about the CEFR, present challenges and possibly some future challenges as well, and then the need for assessment literacy, something that we more and more talk about. We talk about training, but we also talk about the need for literacy in assessment. The beginning of the beginning was the publication of the CEFR. That was not the beginning at all, but basically, let's consider that this was the beginning, 2001. We're not going to go into the threshold level, late 1970s. That would be going back too far. And the CEFR had immediate success, immediate impact. It was translated into more than 45 languages, and at the end of these pieces of translation, we got together with the European language portfolio that was developed in parallel with the CEFR. We've got what is called in the Council of Europe terminology the toolkit. What we have today is a collection of materials, documents, resources, and books that are freely available online in the Council of Europe website that may help teachers and any interested individual or group to get to know better the CFR and how the CFR is used. In fact, the CFR was a good catalyst for what was going on in Europe in the late 1990s. And basically what was going on in Europe was that there was a need for common language policies, there was a need for curriculum development that would match the needs of citizens in Europe who were about to have a common currency. There was a need for better and more transparent testing and assessment, and there was a need for teacher training. And I think that really we can say, looking back and also looking forward, that the CFR has managed to have an impact on all those. I will just tiptoe on these different impacts, because what I would like to draw your attention to is this diagram. I suppose that you can see it clearly. What we teachers do, what we governments do, what we as head of studies do, is try and figure out how to go from the standard, what the agency or what the government decides that we're supposed to be doing at school, to a policy definition of the standard, to an elaborated description of the standard, to the test design and content, and to decisions on how good is good enough in that standard. So we have, as it were, let's think of Barcelona. The government says your schools should meet that standard, and the students leaving the school should be able to respond to that standard. That calls for regulations, that is, the policy definition of a standard, which is normally called a curriculum. And this has to be broken down into palatable bits, which are normally called a syllabus. And this syllabus is the elaborated description that then has to feed onto test design and test content, whether we have to develop an exam or whether we're going to put together a number of observation checklists or whatever that are going to allow us to decide whether these students have met the standard that was set at the beginning. So basically, our life as teachers or educators or policy developers had always to revolve around these, sometimes for many, conundrum, right? Things got clearer but also more complicated when the CFR came up, because it was not anymore in my country we do this, in my country we do that, in my country we do the other, but we had, you know, to operationalize it in terms of the CFR levels. And this is when we started discussing, what do you mean by your B1? What's your B1 like? My B1 is like this and that and the other. What about your B1? You say that your B1 is like my B1, but I don't know, right? So this was what got things going, and that's what triggered what I call the challenges and controversies of the CFR. For some, the CFR is the word of God, but for others, the CFR is the evil. Yeah? The threat that forces you to do whatever you need to do. And for some, the documents that come with the CFR are just like a book of spells. You just follow what is said there and you're going to be easy. But the problem is that when you start to think that just reading and using the CFR is going to be a piece of cake, it's not piece of cake. Because the CFR asks a lot of questions, and you need to respond to these questions in relation to your context, to your methodological approaches, and to what is supposed to be the culture in your context. So things are not as easy as they seem, and that's why the CFR got a number of criticisms and a number of enemies. And around mid-2007, there was a meeting in Strasbourg to analyze how the CFR was being used across Europe, in what respect it was really well known, in what respect it was really used, and what was needed to make things easier for any prospective user. And in this forum, what was done was that a survey was collected from a number of countries, I think there were more than 40 countries, who would say that the CFR had been used for policy development, but had not really yet reached the schools because of insufficient training, because insufficient in-depth knowledge of the CFR, etc., etc., etc. So what the Council of Europe did was set up a number of objectives, but the first one basically was try and make sure that the CFR was contemplated not only from the point of view of the levels, the vertical dimension, but the CFR was paid more attention in terms of the horizontal view, what the CFR contributed to in terms of what does it mean to speak a language, what does it mean to learn a language, how can a language best be taught, how can different curricula for different languages be integrated, how can plurilingualism be approached, etc., etc., etc. Because this metaphor by Daniel Coste, I think, is very useful to see that some of the criticisms that the CFR received were related to an underuse. We've heard this morning that the CFR had been used and abused, but it had also been underused. If you think of a sailboat and you see the sailboat from the distance, you see the sail, but you don't see the hull. But if you only have a sail, there's no sail because the sail does, you know, in my country we say glue, 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 and it sinks into the ocean. So the CFR has the vertical dimension, which is what you see, but it also has this horizontal dimension, which is what holds everything together. So the interest of the Council of Europe and the interest of people who had, you know, started work in depth with the CFR was to get to people to know the CFR better. And this is why the Council of Europe managed to produce a recommendation to ministries and officials in the different governments that would in fact, I mean, the subtitle to this recommendation, if you read it, you might think, if you had read it 2 days ago, you might have thought that it was just, you know, political jargon. But if you go and read it now, you might find it really useful, because in fact the subtitle to this document is "Do not use the CFR in vain." Don't use it in a way that is not used to its best. So this recommendation got the governments in action and got them to pay more attention to training and to quality developments that would enhance the proper use of the CFR. So far, so good with possible criticisms and possible problems. There are many more, I'm sure, but I think I've highlighted the ones that have been most prominent and the ones that I have, you know, been listening to during the breakout sessions. Then there are this part B of the impact on the CFR, and that is the impact on the field of testing and assessment and qualifications. This is Johntrim, and Johntrim's ideal was that education in Europe should converge, and educators in Europe should be able to talk to one another about what they did and why they did it. And in relation to qualifications, he insisted that it was imperative that they were honest, reliable, valid, transparent, and portable. And this, he said again in 2011, that's when I was able to quote him, but he said it at the very beginning of the 21st century. And I think that to quite a great extent, the CFR has managed to make this almost possible. The way that the exams are now in Europe is very different than from the exams that we had in the year 2000 or even the year 2003. And how come that this has happened? This has happened because there's a document called the Manual for Relating Examinations to the CFR that, in the best of the Council of Europe traditions, aims at contributing to competence building, to encouraging increased transparency, and to develop formal and informal national and international networks, trying to make people talk to one another. I do this, you do this. In this case, we're talking about today a national network, but there's been a lot of meetings, international meetings in Europe, and there's been a lot of international meetings, you know, converging Europe and the USA. There's been three meetings so far between ACTFL, the American organization developing tests in a variety of languages, and the CEFR, the first one in Stuttgart, the second one in the USA, the third one in Graz. So there's a lot of interaction, which with the result that everybody is getting better. Everybody knows more about what should be done differently, but at the same time, everything is getting better. So I'm positive in that respect, because thanks to the manual, we've started talking about quality in language assessment. And different institutions look at quality in a different way. If we look at the way Cambridge Assessment looks at quality, they talk about RIP, and RIP consists of validity, meaning am I testing what I'm supposed to testing? Can I trust what decisions I am making, reliability? Is the impact that I'm expecting, or is it something else? So these would be the three big chunks within validity: reliability, impact. There's a fourth one, practicality. Is this doable? Am I complicating my life too much? Can I do it in some other way that is equally good and acceptable, but will be doable and sustainable? And then last but not least, how am I going to generate quality management procedures so that these can be taken on board, you know, year after year after year after year? And these type of procedural approach to quality in language assessment is not different from what was already published in the States in the 1990s and at the beginning of the year 2000. For example, this is another possible model, Quality in Assessment by Downing and Haladina, 2006. What do you think when you think of quality in assessment? First, you think why you need it and what's your overall plan, until you finally write your final technical report. This is an option to quality that has nothing to do with the CEFR, but which has been, you know, revisited by people who may think that what we proposed in the manual was not really too straightforward for them, and they preferred something which was sort of, you know, more detailed, so they can go to other sources, because this is something that is very clear in the manual chapters. This is a proposal. We propose that this is a way of, you know, going about things, but there's other proposals that may be equally good and productive. Just make sure that the crucial point, which is passing scores, point number 9, I'm going to refer to that, because I think that with passing scores, this is the bit where we need to work a bit, you know, harder on. We have improved a lot in general terms on the planning, on the content definition, on the specifications, on putting together a test, on administering it properly, on collecting the data, on writing a report. But we need to work a bit more on justifying when we say this is good. Do we mean that this good this year is equivalent and compatible to the good last year, to the good next year? How portable are our certificates? So these questions have been in the air for the past 10 years, and this is very good, in fact. And also the third approach, which is the manual approach, and which I left to the end. And the manual approach, I think, is very useful because we look at 3 possible phases. The first one is specification, the second one is standard setting, and the third one is validation. Are you familiar with this table? I'll just, very briefly gloss it in 2 minutes. The idea that we had, and it's not that it was the idea of the authors, but it was the insistence of Joe Shields, who's present here today, that the manual had to be equally useful for a small operation in Moldova as a big operation in Ireland or the UK or Paris. So the idea was that the 3 phases would be cumulative, and at the end of each phase, you would be better off than when you started. So the first phase is thinking, how good is my test? Am I doing a good job? Is the test good? Does it have enough quality? And having done that, how does my test map onto the CFR? The CFR talks about domains. What domains am I assessing? The CFR talks about activities. What activities am I assessing? The first phase is specifying what your test is like. If you don't know what your B1 is like, you cannot compare it to any other B1 because you don't know what your B1 is. So, in fact, the first step was specifications. And basically, what each institution that has gone through specification tells us is that they stopped for 1 year after having done specification and revisited the ins and outs of the test in order to get ready for the standard setting, which was the second step. And the second step had to do with deciding where they set the cut score. If we have if you have an exam which has 100 items, what is the pass mark? 56, 65, 52, 57? Is this year going to be 57 and next year 57? Or because we don't have an item bank, this year the pass mark is 57 and next year it's going to be 59? Because we know that this year the test was a bit easier than last year. So, that type of decision is the decisions that you learn to make during the procedures that we explain in the manual, but also elsewhere. There's a full list of references in the manual, references to American researchers, references to the reference supplement, etc., etc., etc. And that was another outcome. So some institution might decide to do the first 2 years specification, rest for 1 year, get things ready, do the standard setting, and then collect information, and when they get funding again, do the validation. And validation not only has to do with validating that your test is in good operation, but also validation that your procedures for setting the cut scores have been taken seriously and can be robust as you would like them to be. So, sorry it's taken me a while to talk about this, but I thought it was needed to know why for some people for some organization producing a fantastic super test is a bit out of reach. So, the super fantastic test might be at the end of the 3 phases. But no matter where your test is, if you start with the first phase, your test will be much better than it was. If you can do the second one, even better. And if you can finish the third one, even better. And this is not something that can be done in 1 year. That's impossible. So take it easy, relax, and do what you can in the best possible way. So apart from the manual, there's a lot of documents that can support you when you are using the manual and attempting at having a decent approach at assessment. Because when we talk about assessment, I didn't ask you to pay sufficient attention to my first slide, where we had different figures illustrating different aspects of assessment. I'm not only worried about how exams are prepared, I'm also worried about how assessments are conducted in everyday classrooms. We don't have to put into practice this schema when we think of our classroom assessment. But knowing about this is going to make our classroom assessments much better. It's going to help us become more systematic. It's going to make us more accountable, because we will know what we're talking about. We need to know that specifications are crucial for an organization developing tests for 2,000 students or 20,000 students, but specifications are useful for us to know where our level is year after year. Students change, but we need to know where our level is. We may be more lenient one year because we know that those students can make up next year. They will make up for it. Different students may need different accommodations, but we need to know where our level is. And the only way to know about this is to have proper specifications. So apart from this, there's a lot of materials that have been produced in 10 years only to help us do better jobs in assessment and testing. And apart from the toolkit that I also already referred to, you've got the manual for relating exams to the CEFR, you've got the manual from ALTE that helps you develop exams, you've got examples from countries like Hungary where you get down-to-earth examples on how to develop and administer and score a test of speaking or a test of writing, and the Inter-Europe series. All of these materials are available online. There's 2 books which are not, but the rest you can Google Inter-Europe and it's on the web, and you can download examples, and there's also examples of items for reading and for listening in the Council of Europe toolkit, and there's going to be a new batch of examples published very soon at the beginning of 2017. There's a lot of performances marked and related to the CEFR, etc., etc., etc. So there's a lot of documentation available. The only problem we have is that we don't have enough time to access everything. But whenever I give a talk like this, I tell teachers that it's worth to spend something like an hour a week just Googling and finding out the goodies in the Council of Europe website. It's going to be reorganized very soon, and it's going to be perhaps more user-friendly. But even so, Google is a fantastic instrument, and you cannot imagine the amount of information you will find which is good, that has to do with rubrics, which has to do with classroom assessment, which has to do with developing analysis procedures for your own tests, etc., etc. So we've got the manual, we've got resources which are available in terms of documents, but we've also got documents that help us assess ourselves in relation to our abilities, in relation to teacher competence, but also assessment. I've just selected a couple which are, I think, the most relevant for you as an audience. The first one is the European Profiling Grid. This is a project led by Equals that developed, following the CEFR, 6 levels of competence in teacher competence, one of them being assessment, and the other one is the EPOSL, the Portfolio for Teachers in Training, which is developed at the ECML, the Council of Europe in Graz, and which you might find very useful if you're involved in teacher training. If you're involved in teacher training, I would suggest that you start with EPOSL. If you're involved in teaching as a coordinator, etc., the European Profiling Grid might be also very useful. It's much simpler, but it's useful to get started. I'm not going to deal into this. These are examples of these 2 tools which help student teachers and teachers in the profession assess their abilities in different aspects of teacher competence. There's also, apart from the documents and apart from the self-assessment instruments that you have, there's a number of institutions that have been created recently, like EALTA, and the number of institutions which already existed, but which, because of the CEFR acting as a catalyst of, the many initiatives in Europe, have, bloomed in assessment and testing in Europe, and that is ALTE and Equals. ILTA is the international organization. I included ILTA because ILTA has a fantastic website full of resources for teachers, full of podcasts. The amount of information that you will find in any of these 4 websites, which belong to different organizations, addressed to different professionals, is incredible. ILTA is basically focused on academics. ALTE, groups, different institutions in Europe preparing exams. Equals, groups, and we've got Tim Goodyear here and Sarah Aitken. Equals, groups, different schools and centers interested in quality and doing their job the best they can. And the ALTA, groups, individuals, teachers, teacher trainers, exam developers interested in the field of assessment and testing. So, knowing what we have, what are the challenges, present and future? Knowing what really is going on. We heard about challenges today. We heard about the need for research, knowing what's going on, collecting evidence, what's happening in the classroom. Everybody has heard about the CEFR. Many teachers claim that they know about the CEFR, but when cornered and asked, and how do you use it, and why do you use it, and how do you think this could be improved, it's obvious that they need to know more, and we don't know exactly what extras are needed, and we don't know exactly how these teachers can be helped. So there's more research on the real impact of the CEFR needed. There's also more research needed on how what has been achieved can be maintained and sustained. It's very easy to convince your authorities to fund a meeting like this. It's very easy to invite a speaker once or twice. It is less easy to keep funding coming regularly so that you've got a proper filing system, a proper collection of clerical help people, a proper table, etc. So managing to consolidate the achievements is important, especially as there are new developments coming. And normally in our profession, what comes last is considered the most important. So there's a lot coming now. There's new descriptors which have been developed, and many of you here in the audience have contributed to the validation of the new descriptors, some of them on mediation, some of them complementing the already existing descriptors. So there's a lot coming in. The Council of Europe has not stopped work. There's a lot on the languages of schooling. There's a lot on the integration of migrants. So there's so much coming in, and which is going to be released publicly in 2017, that we run the risk of forgetting that we were not really there yet 100% in relation to the CEFR. So this is another challenge. And last but not least, we need to think of language assessment and testing in the field of assessment literacy. How can we keep improving not only tests, but also what we do in the classrooms? So we need research, we need evidence, we need to integrate what's coming. This is just an appetizer. I'm not going to go deep into this. There's going to be very soon, many of you, I am sure, have already received a message from Brian North, sent from the Council of Europe, where you were invited to respond to a questionnaire and a survey on the new collection of descriptors. So there's new descriptors for the already existing scales in areas where there were not enough descriptors, basically very low descriptors and the sea levels. Some of the scales were topless. So now there's going to be fewer topless scales. There's new scales to take account of technological changes. There's a collation of suitable CFR scales, CFR-based descriptors for young learners. There was a demand for scales for young learners. What has been done, and that has been the work of a team led by Tim Goodyear, there's been a great effort in putting together all the descriptors available, coming from the CFR itself, but also coming from other sources that really are applicable and useful for young learners. And there's a number of descriptors and scales for mediation and for reactions to literature. So this is going to be something that we need to look forward to, but we need to be prepared to get on board together with all the other, little parcels we have in our rucksack. So this is not a piece of cake, because just for you to have a look at, the new descriptors for mediation respond to this. So there's descriptors for cognitive mediation, for relational mediation, and for mediation strategies. And the vertical slots are the different scales. So we're not talking about 2 scales or 3 scales. We may, after, all the trimming and pruning that will take place after the survey, we may have not as many scales as you see now, but definitely you will not have 3 or 4. You will have many more. So I'm coming to my conclusion now. Last but not least, I wanted to draw your attention on something that may need some more work in the field of assessment and testing, and as I already told you, is on clarifying and making it more transparent, knowing that you can disseminate properly, that your content corresponds to the score. How do you translate the policy to an elaborated description, and how do you translate that elaborated description to a pass? For example, when we give a student a pass, we tell them you've got 74, you've got a B1. What does that 74 mean? How do we illustrate that this 74 is a B1 and not a B2? Does that make sense? 74 correct answers out of 100? How do we come to that conclusion? Why 74 and not 73? And we need to be accountable for that. So we need to work more on how to attach meaning to our scores, which boils down to relating this to the CFR. And another of the issues that we need to pay attention to in the near future is how to try and find links between what goes on in the classroom and how the classroom can benefit from results of international tests and national tests, and vice versa. How national tests and international tests can get information from what's going on in the classroom. All this needs assessment literacy. And I think I only have 1 minute left. Yes. There's an article by Linda Taylor, and I'm just going to step, very briefly on this, where she says that not everybody needs to know everything about language testing and assessment, that what language teachers need to know is not the same as what policymakers need to know, and it's not the same as what test makers need to know. There's core knowledge, there's intermediary knowledge, and there's peripheral knowledge. And these 3 types of knowledge include different elements, and the different elements are the knowledge of theory, the knowledge of sociocultural values, the knowledge of personal beliefs, and the awareness of personal beliefs and attitudes, of principles and contexts, etc. In fact, it boils down, to finish with a CFR note, it boils down that knowing about assessment implies knowledge, knowing about the theory and the basic principles, knowing about skills, savoir-faire, how to put those theories and those principles into practice, but also being aware of your own principles and attitudes, and by putting them into practice, getting the best out of your savoir-être. So this is not different, assessment literacy is not that different from teaching competence. So in fact, my argument is that we may talk a lot about assessment literacy, but assessment literacy is part and parcel of teaching competence, which of course includes testing competence. Because, last but not least, we need to remember that the subtitle of the CEFR is Learning, Teaching and Assessment, and this is the trinity that should inform whatever efforts we make in our profession. The integration of the three branches, learning, teaching and assessment, need to go hand in hand. So this is my bit today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.